My name is Toni, and when I was 17, I was involved in a murder, armed robbery, and assault. I was sentenced 25 to 50 years in prison. I grew up in Southwest Detroit. My mom had me when she was 14 years old. We lived on welfare, and my stepfather was very abusive. Some of the most insidious things happen behind closed doors in homes. My reaction was to get out of the house. And so when I was 12 years old, I took a bus down Michigan Avenue from Southwest Detroit to this place called Bear Lane Town Center. I had never been to another city. I had never been to the mall. And when I stepped my foot inside that mall, I decided I was going to do something different with my life. So I lied my age on an application, and I applied to work at a store. I told them I was 16, I was 12. And I worked at a clothing store for almost 3 years. And I was the top salesperson. And I absolutely loved it because I love fashion, and it was great. My life was good, even though when I went home at night, life was difficult at home. In school, I did well, but I got beat up a lot in the neighborhood. Southwest Detroit is a really rough neighborhood. But one day, there was money that came missing from the cash register. And the people that I worked with, they all knew that I took a bus to work every day. They knew I lived in this poor neighborhood in Southwest Detroit. The other girls that I worked with, they lived in the suburbs. And they accused me of taking the money. I did not take the money. I have no reason to lie to you at this point. I would never have taken from them. That was like my family. That was my refuge. So they fired me. And when I look back on my life growing up in Southwest Detroit, I now know that had I had a mentor working at that store at Bear Lane Town Center, I was surrounded by people I thought were my mentors. And it kept me out of the neighborhood, and it took me away from my home. But when they fired me, I started hanging out in the neighborhood. And I got a boyfriend who was a drug dealer, and he offered me protection in this rough neighborhood. And I became desensitized to selling drugs, and it wasn't violent at that time, though. I was around boys and girls who carried guns, but I had never seen anyone get shot. Well, my boyfriend broke up with me, and so I decided to be a drug dealer myself. I'm very ambitious, right? And I was involved in the drug deal, and I was the driver. And the buyers were robbing the sellers, and the sellers were robbing the buyers. We were all under the age of 19. Now, as a 43-year-old woman, when I look back and I read over the transcripts, there were obviously signs. I should have known right away that this was going to turn into a murder. There were signs now when I look back. But I went along with it, and I think it was because partly I was scared. And I was in this group that I thought offered me protection and a way to make money, like what the other people in the neighborhood were doing. And so one 19-year-old man was shot, another one was paralyzed, 3 boys were convicted with me. No, we were charged. One young man had his case dismissed. We were all charged separately, but all of us ended up in prison. And I was given 25 to 50 years, convicted of second-degree murder as an aider and abetter, and sentenced to Robert Scott Correctional Facility. When I arrived at prison, they gave me my inmate number, 221034, and the woman who processed me said, "Remember this number, memorize it, it's yours for the rest of your life." When I was sent to the maximum security housing unit, I met a woman who had been in prison for 32 years with a crime that was very similar to mine. And the first night that I was taken out of quarantine and put in prison, I woke up, put in my cell. I woke up to noise, and I was scared to get up to see what was going on outside my cell. We had doors, but I was also curious, so I got up and I tiptoed and got on my tippy toes because I was shorter than the window, and there was a guard that was standing at the room right across from me, and he was raping the woman in that room. And I tiptoed back to my bed and went to sleep. I didn't tell anyone about it. But within days, I already knew what my life was going to be like in prison. So the first time I was raped, I didn't know it was rape, because I thought it was a part of prison life. And quite frankly, up until recently, I think every experience felt like rape, because even the things that happened to me as a child, it just always felt so violent. I'm sorry. But I remember the guard taking me into the bathroom and doing what he did to me. And so when you think about rape and you see it on TV, you think, someone who puts a gun to a woman's head and forces them, rapes them. Well, custodial rape inside a prison is much different. It happened. I didn't want to be with that person, and I walked away, and I know how it made me feel, and I didn't feel that I could say no. Quite frankly, if I did say no, I don't know that that would have stopped it, but it happened several times, and it was happening to all the women around me. And so one day I had decided, if I had to be in prison for the rest of my life, because I really thought I was going to be in prison for the rest of my life, then I wasn't going to be a urinal for correctional officers and a prisoner for the rest of my life. So I had to get strong to fight for changes. And I started studying a book called A Course in Miracles. And it's all about coming from a place of love, compassion, and forgiveness. And I had decided that I was going to make prison a beautiful place, because that was going to be my home, right? Nobody was getting out. So I started planting flowers and doing yoga and having yoga groups. And also, I started writing down the stories of the women around me and the stories of the guards, how they came into the bathroom while we were changing, how they watched us shower, how they called us bitches and whores, and how they raped us. And I started organizing. I didn't know that I was organizing, though, until years later when I read a book about Barack Obama organizing in Chicago. Then I was like, oh yeah, that's what I was doing. But I started going to the most popular women on count, the toughest women on count, and convincing them to tell their story. And we had a group of attorneys who were working. There was a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit, and it was those stories that I had recorded over several years that the attorney used to present this case, a trial. And so that was a turning point for me. When I realized in prison that I could make changes, that I could speak up for myself, that I could say no, that I am more than my past, life became much better for me. And it was also a turning point where I realized that I just had to surrender. Just like Ronnie and Mario said, that they just surrendered. I surrendered. I said, if this is going to be my life, I'm going to make prison a great place, a place for healing. And it was when I surrendered, everything started happening. My case was one of the cases that Governor Granholm chose. I received a commutation as well, and it happened just one day. They came and told me the parole board wants to see you. Now, I had a long indeterminate sentence, so I had never seen the parole board, and I wasn't scheduled to see the parole board for years, and so I was shocked. And I saw the parole board, and they handed me a piece of paper, and they said, fill this out with the pen right now. It was a petition for sentence commutation. Now see, they wanted me out. I had filed a commutation in 2001, and it was denied, of course, by Governor Engler, but they had that packet when they came to see me. And then, we have your commutation, a 7-year-old commutation, but here, let's make it valid, because they're only good for 2 years. Here, fill this out. So I hand wrote it really quick and gave it to them, and within 6 months, I was released. Now, I thought that all my problems were over. I looked at my future through rose-colored lenses, and I had inherited a platform, because the work that I had done in prison, the media used my story to talk about the cases, the lawsuit, and the abuse in prison. And so by the time I was released from prison, articles had been written about me, and I was on a speaking circuit. People were calling me and telling me to share my story at universities, at conferences. I think I had a speaking engagement scheduled. I came home like on a Tuesday, and I had one scheduled for Thursday. It was crazy. I started working right away. I was very fortunate. I had my dream job. I was working at an organization that helped women and girls, provided educational tools to women and girls in Southwest Detroit. So I was working with youth groups. Part of my job was organizing in the neighborhood for safer communities, better schools, and I was always implementing these youth prevention programs and working with moms who had troubled youth. But this platform that followed me, I couldn't get away from my story. Having my life so public has affected me in every area. It has affected me personally. So how I dealt with it the first 4 years was I just stayed busy. The art of being busy. I worked full-time, I went to grad school, I volunteered, and then something wonderful happened. I became pregnant with my daughter, and she was a planned pregnancy. I wanted her really bad. And life slowed down, which happens to moms. Life slows down. And I started rethinking everything. and I suffer from postpartum depression. At the same time, I had someone stalking me, someone who had read all the public articles, sending me hundreds of emails a day, threatening to harm me, calling me a murderer, a whore, that I deserved the things that happened to me. And I was reading them as I got the emails. Everyone says don't read them, but I was reading them because I didn't know. At first I thought it was correction officers, but I ended up finding out who it was, and the person who was doing this had been in a mental hospital, and he did this before to other women, but I didn't know that at the time. But anyways, it affected me, and I fell into deep, deep depression. One summer, I closed all the blinds on my house. My daughter was about 6 or 7 months. I was afraid to leave the house. I started having flashbacks of the things that happened to me, of my crime. I remember looking in my daughter's eyes and thinking about the mom who lost her son. I almost couldn't live with myself. I thought about everything that happened to me in prison, and then all the women who are still there. I have survivor's guilt. I feel guilty for surviving and being home while all my sisters are still there. And I struggled. I could not come out of that deep, dark depression. And finally I did. And I did a lot of work on myself, spiritually, professionally. I've worked with some trauma coaches. I've worked with David. And I'm in a much better place. And, there came a point where I had to make a decision, and my decision was, do I keep putting myself out there as an advocate? And if I do, can I deal with it? Or do I just step back and let the other people coming out do it, and just be Sophia's mom? And I tried that. It doesn't work. Felonies are forever. Our life is public. I can't be someone else. I can only be who I am. Not only did I inherit a platform, but I inherited a responsibility to do well, not just for me, not just for my daughter, not just for my community, but for the women who are still incarcerated, who deserve a second chance. And that's why I choose to continue to work through the fear and the pain and be an advocate for women and girls and juvenile justice reform. If I could say something to the parole board or Governor Schneider, I would say that over-incarceration serves no one. There's a point in every sentence, there's a point where any longer time just causes more trauma. And quite frankly, it's my experience that women who go to prison cannot heal in a prison environment because you're in the fight or flight zone your entire incarceration. And you can't begin the healing process when you're walking around like that. You're trying to survive. In order to heal, you have to feel safe and protected. And so I asked them to consider the conditions in prison and consider giving some women a second chance outside of confines. Thank you.